Ever get that feeling? Like you read tons of articles, even taken some notes, but then later it's like, poof, gone. Like trying to remember a dream. The details just vanish. So why is it that so much of what we try to learn just doesn't stick? That's what we're diving into today, exploring a pretty fascinating idea about why that happens. And we're going to look at a completely different way of thinking about education and knowledge. Something that could seriously change how you learn and remember things.
Yeah, it's really interesting. What we're looking at today comes from an insightful article. It's by Shiva Narayan Takshila, and it's called Forced Learners and Focused Learners, Transforming Education Through Learnography. What's so interesting about this article is the contrast it makes between two types of learners. It basically says that traditional schools might actually be accidentally creating what it calls forced learners. So these are people whose main reason for learning is because of outside pressure. Not really because they want to understand things for themselves.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Think back to your own school days, or maybe even some professional training you've had to do. Does that idea of being a forced learner ring a bell? The article goes deep into this whole thing. It talks about how learning is often driven by things like grades, deadlines, fear of getting in trouble, and that often leads to just passively taking in information, right? And as we all know, that kind of learning, it's not very strong. The article even says that this kind of pressure, this lack of real interest, can lead to not remembering things, and sometimes even completely zoning out, or even causing some behavior problems. It makes learning feel like something you have to do, not something you actually want to do.
And you know, when you step back and look at the bigger picture, it makes you wonder if just relying on teachers to make us learn is really effective in the long run. I mean, if the only reason you're paying attention in class is because you're scared of getting a bad grade or missing a deadline, what happens when those things go away? Does that desire to learn and explore just disappear? The article says that a lot of times it does, which can lead to feeling burned out by school and even feeling like learning just isn't part of who you are.
But here's where it gets really exciting.
Yeah.
Because the article doesn't just point out the problem. It actually gives us a different way to think about things. It introduces the concept of focused learners and a whole philosophy of learning called learnography. It paints this picture of a totally different kind of learner, someone who approaches learning with real attention, a feeling of ownership over what they're learning, and a really deep understanding of things.
Absolutely. The things that describe these focused learners are pretty amazing. We're talking about being driven by what's called intrinsic motivation. That means you're genuinely curious about things. You want to master a skill just for the sake of it. You're driven by your own personal purpose. And it goes beyond just passively sitting there and absorbing information. They're actively involved in the learning process. The article specifically mentions them creating brain page maps and modules through something called structured motor practices.
Hold on a second. Let's talk about this brain page thing for a minute. This sounds really different. When the article talks about structured motor practices,
Uh-huh.
what does that actually look like? Like, how do you make these brain page maps and modules?
Okay, so from what the article says, it's a very hands-on way of taking knowledge from somewhere like a book and putting it into your own way of thinking. Imagine actually doing things with the information, using your body. This could mean writing really detailed summaries in your own words, making visual stuff like diagrams or mind maps, or even like using objects to represent ideas. The key is you're not just reading or listening. You're actively putting that information into your brain through physical actions. The article says that this active way of learning is also super important for getting better at emotional intelligence. Things like being more aware of yourself as you learn, being resilient when things get tough, and even better at collaborating with others when you learn this way. And because you're actually using your body to build this brain page, the knowledge sticks with you better. It gets stored in what's called your procedural memory, which makes it so much easier to remember things long term and actually use what you've learned. It's like learning a sport or how to play music. The more you practice, the better you get.
So it's about more than just thinking about stuff. It's about actually interacting with what you're learning physically. And the article also mentioned these miniature schools and learners actually taking on leadership roles in those LERTs. What's the thinking behind that?
That's a really important part of how learnography works. These miniature schools are basically groups of students who learn together. And the students themselves lead the group. So maybe one person is in charge of asking questions, another makes sure everyone stays on track, and someone else might be the one who figures out how to use the knowledge. This whole setup really helps you get better at teamwork. Because you're learning to work with other people, you get a strong sense of responsibility because you have a job to do in the group. And it naturally helps you develop leadership skills as you try out different roles. It's not all about the teacher being in charge, it's about sharing that responsibility and learning from each other.
This whole learnography approach, it's so different from how most of us learned in school. And the article talks about some key elements of this model. Let's break those down a bit. First up, brain page making, which we've already touched on. The article says this active process of creating and practicing modules straight from the source material really helps build those strong connections in your brain that make you remember things.
Right. And when you actually write things down, make diagrams, or find other ways to put the information into your own words, and then you practice it by explaining it to yourself or someone else, it reinforces what you're learning in several ways. It's not just passively looking over things again. It's an active process of remembering and rebuilding the information, which makes both your understanding of the facts and figures stronger. That's what we call declarative memory. And it makes you better at actually using that knowledge and finding it when you need it, which is that procedural memory we talked about.
Then we have these miniature schools, which are pretty cool. The idea that these peer-led groups can help you learn so many important skills that go way beyond the actual subject matter is really fascinating.
Yeah, it creates this dynamic where you're not just learning from the teacher, you're learning from everyone in the group. You learn to explain things clearly to make sure everyone understands, and you get to see things from different points of view, which makes your own understanding even better. Plus, sharing the responsibility can really motivate you to learn.
The third element is cyclized rehearsal. It sounds like a very specific technique. Can you explain what that actually involves?
Think of it as a really smart and organized way of reviewing and strengthening the things you've learned. It's space-guided and time-modulated, which basically means there's a plan for when you go back and look at the information again. Maybe you review something right after you learn it, then again a day later, then a week later, and so on. It's like a cycle of review that's spaced out in a way that helps you remember things better. The idea is to catch the information before you forget it and make those connections in your brain stronger over time so you can access and retrieve that knowledge easily. It's like taking care of a garden. You don't just plant the seeds and forget about them. You keep coming back and taking care of them so they can grow strong.
And then there's the SOTM framework, space, object, time, instance, and module. It's basically a way to organize how you learn things. How does this framework help in the learning process?
This framework gives you a really useful way to organize and understand new information. By thinking about the space where something happens, the objects involved, the time it happened, specific instances or examples that illustrate the concept, and how it all fits into a larger module of knowledge, you create a deeper and more connected understanding. It takes learning beyond just abstract facts and helps you see how they apply to the real world. For example, if you're learning about a historical event, that's your module, you might consider the specific place where it happened, the space, the key things involved, the objects, the time period, the time, specific events or turning points, the instances, and how it all fits into the bigger picture of history.
And lastly, there's the idea of the happiness classroom. It's the opposite of the stressful, anxiety-ridden classroom that we often associate with forced learning. So what makes a happiness classroom different? What's it like?
The main thing is creating a learning environment where you feel safe and supported. You can take risks, try new things, and learn from your mistakes without feeling judged or afraid to fail. It's about creating a positive connection to learning, which the article says can make a huge difference in how much you engage, how motivated you are, and how well you remember things. When you're happy and comfortable in your learning environment, you're more likely to be curious, to participate actively, and to embrace challenges.
So when we compare forced learners and focused learners side by side, the differences are pretty huge. Forced learning, like the article says, is mostly driven by pressure from outside, which leads to that passive engagement and knowledge that doesn't really last. It seems like forced learning needs the teacher to be constantly pushing students, and sadly, it can be based on fear of failure.
That's a really important point. The article stresses that this fear-based motivation in forced learning often results in a patchy and temporary understanding of the material. But focused learning it encourages you to take charge of your own learning and find your own purpose. You're not just sitting there taking in information, you're actively building these brain page modules through physical engagement, which leads to a much deeper understanding and memory that lasts much longer.
And it's not just about the way they learn, it's about how they feel while they're learning. Forced learning can definitely create stress and anxiety, while focused learning, especially in a supportive environment like a happiness classroom, creates a much more positive and helpful atmosphere for learning and growing.
Exactly. And the article makes a really cool connection to the science of movement. It explains that learnography isn't just about what goes on in your head. It's closely connected to what you do with your body. When you physically engage with the material by writing, drawing, or moving things around, you're activating different parts of your brain, including areas like the basal ganglia and substantia nigra. These areas aren't just involved in movement and learning, they also play a role in motivation and how you regulate your emotions. This motor knowledge, which is basically the way your brain remembers physical activity, creates a much stronger and longer lasting form of memory compared to just listening or watching passively. Like the article says, you learn better by doing, not just by listening. Think about when you learned to tie your shoelaces. You didn't just watch someone else do it, you had to actually practice the movements yourself.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
Hmm.
Think about learning any practical skill, like playing an instrument or computer programming. You can read all about it, but you only really learn it by doing it. Sounds like learnography uses that same idea for learning academic subjects and concepts.
Exactly. And being actively involved like this has a big impact on what the article calls academic identity. It's not just about the grades you get, it's about how you see yourself as a learner, how confident you feel in your ability to learn new things and use them.
And the difference here is really big, isn't it? Someone who is always being forced to learn might start to feel like they're not good enough or that they always fail. They might start to connect learning with negative emotions and try to avoid anything that challenges them academically.
While a focused learner who enjoys mastering things through active engagement and effort is much more likely to develop what we call a growth mindset. They see challenges as opportunities to learn and feel proud of what they've achieved. The long-term effects are significant. Focused learners are more likely to keep learning throughout their lives and come up with new ideas. While the article suggests that forced learners unfortunately might carry some academic trauma with them, which can make it harder for them to learn new things later on.
So if we want to change our education systems, or even just the way we learn ourselves, what are some concrete steps we can take to shift from forcing people to learn to helping them become focused learners? These could be some real aha moments for those of you listening out there.
The article suggests a few key changes. First, we need to move away from the traditional way of teaching, where it's mostly about the teacher talking and lecturing. Instead, we should focus on what's called brainpage practice, where the emphasis is on you engaging directly with the learning materials and actively practicing and internalizing what you learn using those motor-based activities we talked about.
That really turns the traditional classroom upside down, doesn't it? The teacher becomes more of a guide or facilitator
Yeah,
instead of the main person giving out information.
exactly. The second step is to give power to those miniature schools. Set up those peer-led learning groups where you're more responsible for your own learning and you contribute to the learning of the people in your group through collaboration and accountability.
The third point is about training the learners themselves, not just the teachers. It says educators need to become learnographers, people who are skilled at designing engaging learning modules and guiding that motor-based interaction with the material. It also says it's important to teach people effective ways to learn new things right from the start.
This acknowledges that if you've mostly been a forced learner, learning how to be a focused learner might take some practice and new skills. You need to learn how to learn in this new, more active way.
The fourth step is to intentionally create happiness classrooms, environments where you feel safe and supported,
Yeah.
you get helpful feedback, and you're encouraged to explore, be curious, and develop a positive relationship with learning.
Because, like we talked about before, your feelings and emotions while you're learning are just as important as the thinking part. When you feel safe and supported, you're more likely to be open to new challenges and keep going when things get tough.
And the final point is the one-day, one-book system, which sounds pretty intense. The idea is to spend a whole day deeply focused on one subject or one book. It's about going all in on a topic to really understand it deeply and build a more complete brain page than you could with a more scattered approach.
It's about making time and space to truly immerse yourself in a topic, minimizing distractions, and allowing yourself to make deeper connections and develop a more holistic understanding than you might get with a more fragmented approach to learning.
The article ends by saying that choosing between forced learning and focused learning isn't just about teaching methods. It's a moral and developmental choice. It argues that every single person who's learning deserves the chance to become an active, engaged, and confident learner.
And it strongly emphasizes that learnography gives us a real and clear framework to make that transformation happen, to move away from the old, passive ways of teaching and create a dynamic model where learners aren't just sitting there being fed information. They're actively participating and even leading their own learning and helping others learn. The way the article ends really drives this point home. It says, let's build schools where students learn with purpose, not with pressure. Let's replace the talking classroom with the brain page classroom. Let's raise a generation of focused learners. It's a powerful call to action.
It really is. So as you've been listening to us, the key thing to think about is the fundamental difference between just passively absorbing information because someone is making you fair and actively building knowledge because you have a real purpose and you're truly engaged. Think about your own learning journey, whether it was in school or just in life in general. When have you felt like a forced learner, pushed by things you had to do? And when have you felt that inner drive and deep satisfaction of being a focused learner? What parts of this learnography model really speak to you in your own way of learning?
And like the article suggests, think about actively seeking out ways to learn that put you in charge, that feed your natural curiosity, and that focus on helping you remember things for a long time and actually use what you learn. These principles of being actively involved and having a real purpose when you learn aren't just for school. They can be incredibly useful for anyone at any point in their life who wants to learn more effectively and feel good about it.
The article we've been talking about today, Forced Learners and Focused Learners, Transforming Education Through Learnography, was written by Shiva Narayan. It's all about what he calls the Takshila model learnography. If you're curious about this and want to dive deeper, you can find more information about this system learnography on the Takshila page. It's a really comprehensive and thought-provoking approach to rethinking how we learn and how we can become more deeply and meaningfully engaged with knowledge.
All of this brings us to a final thought for you to consider. What if the real secret to truly understanding and remembering things is not just about passively listening or reading, but about what you actively do with that information, the effort you put in both physically and mentally to make it a part of you?
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
Until then, keep those brain pages turning.